Welcome. Welcome to the Practice Research Symposium. Like I said downstairs, I'm Dr. Andrea Eggersley. I'm the Higher Degrees by Research Coordinator in the School of Fashion and Textiles, and I'm also the Chair of PRS Australia. I'm super happy to see you all here tonight to celebrate the work of our HDR candidates who've completed and one left to complete their examinations. My role is to introduce the next phase of the PRS activities, which involves the milestones and the WIPs in progress panel presentations, but also the series of discussions and conversations, and to welcome you here tonight to hear our keynote speakers. So tonight I'm really grateful for Marc Jacques, Professor of Architecture, Urbanism, and Dr. Gwyllim, Jahn, co-founder and creative director of Fologram, for coming to join us for our keynote presentations, exploring the distinction and overlaps between industry and the academy in the context of design practice research. It's been an extraordinarily big week already as part of the inaugural DSC Doctoral Research Conference, which is the umbrella that PRS is sitting within. And over the last few nights, the theme has been around regenerative futures, and we've had keynotes by Professor Heather Horst on Monday evening and Dr. Nina Terry and Dr. Melis Sonova last night. So regenerative futures is a call to go beyond sustainability, asking for a collective transformation of our economy and society with a focus on healing our environment. And I see this theme building on our discussions on responsible practice from the last PRS that we had in October. Thinking about regenerative futures is another way we as a community of practitioners could advance the work of recognising our First People, recognising Indigenous ways of knowing the land that prioritises an attention to the caring of country that's concerned with temporalities that exceed our own. So on behalf of RMIT and the PRS, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university. We respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders, past, present, and emerging, and I want to pay my respects to any Indigenous and First Nations people in the room this evening. I'd also like to acknowledge our DSC Research Elder in Residence, Narwit, Professor Carolyn Briggs, and her generous welcome that she extended to us yesterday, and in particular during Beau's exam, and I know Vivian will speak to this in a moment. RMIT conducts research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities across Australia, and the university pays respects to their continuing custodianship of country. So we've had 5 public postgrad examinations with Beau, Rob and Rebecca from the School of Architecture and Urban Design, Nirma from the School of Fashion and Textiles, and Stephen from the School of Media and Communication, with Saeed still to be examined from the School of Design. And I want to say congratulations to all of you. Thanks to the chairs, the supervisors, and also to the examiners. And you can see the exhibition of exam candidates, if you haven't already had a look this evening, downstairs in the Design Hub Gallery after tonight's conversations, but also over the next 3 days from 11 to 2. So in addition to the examination exhibition of works that you can see, we're also going to have another ginormous PRS with 120 presentations. And so thanks to all the candidates who'll be presenting their work over the coming days, and to the supervisors and panel members for all the time and effort that you're putting into this. We also have a series of really fantastic workshops and discussions, and I want to say a special thank you to Professor Naomi Steed, Director of the Design and Creative Practice Enabling Capability Platform, and Chris Speed, who you met earlier with the big book launch, who is the Professor of Design for Regenerative Futures, for their unwavering support and contribution to the planning of these events. I'm really very grateful. So tomorrow's lunchtime panel discussion is a conversation on regenerative educational futures, chaired by Naomi, with Chris Speed, in conversation with the School of Design's Dean, Professor Andrea Sotomok. And tomorrow evening, Philippa Duthie, Oceania Director of the Royal Society of the Arts, will join Professor Andrea Sotomok to reflect on the outcomes of an emerging collaboration between the Royal Society of Arts, Oceania, and RMIT that explores the significance of regenerative thinking in higher education contexts worldwide. We're really lucky to have Philippa return for Friday's lunchtime workshop with Chris. And on Saturday, we have Associate Professor Katrina Simon share her expertise in mapping with Chris again, returning for a final time. He'll be very exhausted at the end of this, for a workshop on charting research territory. And I want to share that the library team will also have a presence upstairs in the long room on level 10 during tomorrow. So if you've got any spare library questions you want to throw out, the team will be up there. And on Friday, we've got Dr. Fatini Toso from the Research Governance and Ethics will be up on level 10. So if you have any tricky ethics questions and you just want to drop by and say hi, Fatini will be there. You'll also see on level 10 when the lifts open, the return of the Distabling, the Acts of Emergent Design Research. So this is in its second edition, doctoral candidates from the School of Design, showcasing a range of current research projects conducted during Melbourne Design Week. I really want to say thank you to everyone involved in all these discussions, presentations and conversations for sharing their time and knowledge. Thank you also to the teams working hard behind the scenes, with a special mention to Anastasia Bakker, who's worked carefully to ensure that the exams run really smoothly, in addition to checking on all the moving parts of this PRS here in Australia. It takes a great effort to organise all of this activity, and I would like to take a moment to offer my sincere gratitude. I'd really like to thank the whole of the Research Ops team, led by Alan Shanks, the event officers, Catherine Ross and Nicole Scott, to Hannah Lane and Queenie Ho. Shout out to Cicely Wong in Research and Training Services team for the coordination of the scheduling and milestones and work in progress presentations. To Eric North, Tim McLeod, Simon Masish, Pat Mooney and Mason Cox and RMIT Culture Production team for supporting both our in-person and pre-recorded exam candidates, to Andrew Tetzlav, Elise Barton and Jemima Penny in RMIT Culture. At RMIT ITS AV Insight, I'd like to thank Ryan, Kim, Arlo, Belinda and Nick for their support during the examinations, across the milestone presentations and tonight. And the facilities team at Architecture and Urban Design, specifically Charles Shepherd and Lewis Viddock, who set up the spaces in the design hub for the milestones and whips, make sure things are working upstairs for us. And I'd also like to thank the School of Architecture and Urban Design for, again, generously sharing your spaces with us. We're really very grateful as a community. As Chair of PRS Australia, I'd like to acknowledge the support of my fellow PRS chairs. There's a few more names to get through, so I'm very grateful for your patience. I really want to say thanks to Jess and James and Paul, also the HDR coordinators from across the college who are really involved in making this a really great event. So James again, Charles, Ingrid and Keely. I also want to acknowledge DSC HDR Director Stephen Gaunson and Associate Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research and Innovation Ralph Horn. Finally, I want to remind you that the closing drinks will be held at the Oxford Scholar from 5:30 on Saturday, and I will see you there. So, with all of that, it is now my pleasure to welcome Professor Vivian Mitsogianni, Dean of RMIT School of Architecture and Urban Design, to introduce this evening's keynote with Mark Jacques and Gwyllim, Jahn. Some of you might not know Professor Mitsogianni, that she is a registered architect, director of Matt Studio Architects, a multi-AIA award-winning collaborative focused on architectural design research practitioner. She undertakes practice-based research with a focus on experimental design process and supervises design practice PhD candidates in Australia, Europe, through RMIT's PRS. And we're really grateful to have you here. Thank you so much, Vivian.
Thanks, Andrea, and also a very special thank you, Andrea, for your outstanding stewardship of the PRS AU event. So on behalf of the Design and Social Context School Deans participating in the PRS, so the School of Design, School of Art, Media and Communication, Fashion and Textiles, welcome to the PRS and welcome also to the School of Architecture and Urban Design. Congratulations to all the PhD candidates that have completed over the last few days. For our school, a special acknowledgement to RMIT Architecture staff member Beau DeBell, who completed his examination yesterday. So Beau joined our school as a VC Indigenous pre-doc in 2020. In Australia, I believe Beau's PhD will be only the second in the architecture discipline by an Indigenous architect and the first PhD by project. So congratulations, Beau. I think you're probably having a good rest, but in your absence, we're very proud of you. Beau's PhD is titled Message Stick Protocols, Fostering First Nations Cultural Empowerment in the Built Environment. In what is an outstanding and actually incredibly generous PhD, Beau spoke of the, quote, economy of consultation that exists now in the built environment, and he's developed what he calls promotional protocols, not prescriptive protocols for engagement. Importantly, the PhD provides valuable tools through which to empower Indigenous communities in the consultation design process. So congratulations, Beau. A major contribution of Beau's PhD is to design process. Oh, maybe we'll stay there. So a major contribution is to design process, and this is the case for the design practice PhD mode here, irrespective of what other contributions are made. Designing and design are specific skill sets that require specific knowledge in relation to processes, techniques, approaches, and this knowledge is transferable. In my discipline, architecture, the knowledge is transferable across different programs, briefs, building types, different situations. And within the academy, it's transferable and applicable across different research thematics. One of the most important things that the community of the PRS does is to acknowledge and make space for the legitimacy of design and designing within an academic context. And I say within an academic context because in professional practice, it is taken for granted that designing is a specific and highly valuable skill set and knowledge, and does not require justification in relation to other activities. We don't apologise for being designers, and we don't apologise for the knowledge we have as designers. So a major contribution of these PhD is in design process itself, so that designers and others can understand what we actually do when we design and what is required to design. So not the spin, not the application of external theories to justify what we do, but a careful exploration of design process. Now, the first graduates of this, or what is now this PRS program, completed what was then an architecture reflective practice research program. So that was over 32 years ago, being first exhibited in 1992. And since then, there's been an evolution and an expansion of the model, as well as debate and experimentation with the format of the PRS events, including the purpose or even desire for a keynote. And I think what's evident as this forum becomes bigger and bigger, that we can and we do and will frame a community around design practice research. So it's very clear what the mission of this program is and why we're here. But back to the keynote, it's hotly contested. Do we have a keynote? What's the point of the keynote? Should you leave drinks in the middle of the opening to come to the keynote? So we thought for this keynote we'd reinstate a keynote format designed for the candidates and with design practitioners in mind. And there are many here at the PRS, in which we invite past candidates to reflect on their reflection. So we invited two presenters who will reflect on the trajectory of their candidature and, in keeping with my previous comments, the overlap between what we might call their professional practice and the academy, and most importantly, how the PhD has catalysed the next phase of their practice. So we always say that the PhD is really about what will come next. So today's presentation is titled "And Then Design Practice Research and the PRS as an Incubator of Future Practice." Our presenters are, and I'll introduce both of them at the start, Professor Mark Jacques, who was appointed Professor of Architecture Urbanism Industry Fellow within RMIT School of Architecture and Urban Design in 2015. Mark is a director of the landscape architecture and urban design practice Open Work, and the practice has been awarded many, many significant awards, including the Australia Award for Urban Design, the Melbourne Prize, and the Premier's Design Award. Our second presenter is Gwyllim Jahn. Gwyll is a lecturer in architecture in RMIT and the co-founder and creative director of Follogram, a design research practice and technology startup developing software for designing and making in mixed reality. Follogram's clients include leading universities, multinational architecture firms, industrial designers, engineers and artists who are building mixed reality applications for full-scale construction, public art, architectural fabrication, sculpture, automotive design and cyber-physical visualisation systems. Gwyll's delivered lectures and workshops at international institutions including UCLA, ETH, SCIARC, MIT, USC, Stuttgart, ICD, UCL, UTS, Tongji and Tsinghua University. I did say let's keep it tight. It is a dinner show, but we will hopefully have time for some questions at the end. So please join me in welcoming our first presenter, Professor Mark Jacques.
Oops, actually. No, it's just the stack. Thank you, Vivian, and thank you everyone for being here. I want to talk to this idea of the PRS as an incubator by talking first about a way of working that's developed during and since my PhD research, and I describe that practice as something that oscillates between two behaviours, each of which expands and reframes the other. These two modes or places are my office, a commercial practice, as Vivian has said, called Open Work, and this place, the place that we're in, the speculative space of RMIT, where I teach into the Masters of Architecture, Masters of Urban Design, and where I undertook my thesis by reflective practice. On paper, the split between the two is 60% in practice and 40% here. In reality, it's probably a little bit more weighted to practice. I think this is definitely a discussion or a talk as a practitioner. Throughout the PhD, which I'll talk about later, I characterise the behaviours of commercial practice as waiting to be asked by a client for permission to act, and the behaviours of design studio research as asking in order to act and then waiting for some form of forgiveness. And in a sense, all the things that I've done in the years that I've been here are about jumping between or oscillating between these two behaviours to play one off against the other. In the next set of slides, the work that you see on the left-hand side is the work of the practice, and the work on the right is done through the university. So an example of working across these two spaces is seen through a research interest in the latent civic potential of the suburbs. This started some years ago here as part of the suburban realism studios and projects led by Dean Boothroyd, which were a polemic against the Victorian Planning Authority's process of designing new suburbs, new town centres, as discrete uses masquerading as a main street. This research accidentally slipped into the real world as Haven't You Always Wanted, the 2016 NGV Architecture Commission by Matt Studio, a project that celebrated the latent civic in a suburban car wash, and then, led by Vivian, came back into the space of the university as What If, which was a project around virtual reality's ability to customise the architectural object. The speculation on another form of the civic in the suburbs has jumped back into the practice with Openwork and OMA's commissions on new town centres in Melbourne's fringe, returning to the original problem by collapsing the components of the VPA's proxy Main Street into a single building with both public services and private capital. And this building's totally liberated from any vestige of the high street. And I guess the sort of meta point here is that it's difficult to imagine an outcome such as this particular project with OMA that was done in a pure sense, totally within practice or totally within the academy. The breaching of those two spaces gives it some sort of charge. Another example of working across these two modes is research into forms of memorialisation undertaken with Amy Muir. Initially, an idea born in the shared space of a studio that we share, practice, led to a self-sponsored project on cemeteries, which was brought back into the university as a series of studios around embedding the architectural language of memorialisation into landscape. Again, thanks to the NGV, this escaped into the real world as a temporary commission in 2018 called Double Ground, which was an undeclared memorial to Roy Grounds' pre-renovated gallery. And its moves of cutting and folding the land became permanent as the Victorian Family Violence Memorial in 2021, which Openwork and Amy co-designed together. A third form of research is the shared infrastructure of urban precincts and how designers might deploy the kind of spatial design tools not yet entertained by the Victorian planning scheme. This started as a Masters of Urban Design studio at RMIT, looking at shared infrastructure within the Hoddle block, and then conditioned the office's actions and behaviours in the design of an urban plan for Nightingale Village, or the precinct in Brunswick. That project became a prototype for autonomous and separate developments sharing precinct-scaled infrastructure. And then a critique of some of the unintended consequences of the scale and built character of Nightingale Village was brought back into the university in the extremely small and very loud studios, which are exploring disaggregated creative precincts in Brunswick that leverage off existing infrastructure rather than superimposing new ones. And then finally, there's an emerging research interest in urban ecology, which started as a commercial project for a new public space on the industrial deck of Collins Wharf in Docklands, but came into the speculative space of the university via RMIT Icon Science, which worked with us to develop a scale model of a novel habitat prototype for fauna exhibited downstairs as part of Wild Hope, that now looks like returning to practice as part of the office's work on Market Square, which is a 1.8 hectare park replacing the Queen Victoria Market Southern Car Park, which sits on top of the former Melbourne Cemetery site. So I'm able to argue through my PhD research findings that it's this oscillation, a deliberate infidelity to the orthodox modes of commercial practice, or the behaviours of the discipline of landscape architecture, that gives the work some kind of charge. Those two modes of work made in two types of space expand and reframe the other. But that wasn't what the PhD was meant to be about. And this is where we start talking particularly to candidates, I suppose. When I started this, I saw the PhD as something that was actually quite a serious contribution to public space by somehow seeing design as a way of accelerating the difference in physical co-presence in the city. This was my 3-year plan of attack. This is sort of post-rationalised. None of this work was in the PhD itself. But the idea was that I'd take the commercial work that I was doing at the time, at that point, part of a practice called Oculus, amplify its intentions through what I saw as a spectrum of public good and public exchange, put on a show like Patrick Keeler did at the Tate in 2011, and wrap it up in 2018. So sort of a 3-year plan, nice and easy. And it's no accident that the following diagrams look like a mess, as it charts the actual progression of the PhD, which was very different to and a lot longer than the original plan. Certainly PRS1 started along the Robin Hood public good route to a simultaneously encouraging and dubious panel, which I think is a standard for PRS1. By PRS2, I'd stalled entirely after realising that whatever I thought there was in the work resisted projection. It couldn't be amplified because I was talking at the work retrospectively, not through the work in its making. And in a kind of panic, I began superimposing frameworks over the projects in the hope that something would stick, but nothing did. By PRS3, I'd heeded the panel's advice to map a process of working, not in a retrospective way, but in real time as it was occurring, while occupied in the mode of practice, which is largely, for me, around physical model making. I documented a series of observations of what was going on, in this instance, a master plan for a project in Fisherman's Bend, spelling out tacit knowledge, particularly around how I saw the site, which ultimately informed the language I used to write chapter 1 of the dissertation, which in that chapter was called The Isolating Eye. For PRS4, this process of tactile mindfulness continued via a series of drawings that tried to map the instruments deployed in the projects, where those instruments came from, how they seemed to work with a tactical efficiency. And these observations became chapters 4 and 5 of the dissertation that talked about the French idea of détournement, or rerouting the site using economical means, and rendition, which is this idea of a transfer of a place or a body from one site or another, one site to another, I should say. PRS5 was a dip in the healthy green line, perhaps a bit full of myself after 2 productive symposium presentations. I fell back into quite bad projective habits in PRS5 by proposing a project for an exhibition that, unencumbered by any brief or, frankly, any idea at all, heaped a series of unedited notions and gestures on top of one another in a mess that was antithetical to the tactical efficiency that I'd successfully described in PRS4. It was the sore reflections on this failure that brought about one of the key shifts in understanding of the research, that the problem of commercial practice, or at least the commercial practice as I practice it, is having to be asked in the first place, and that as a result, the designer's own meta brief deployed alongside the client's official brief gives the designer new and self-sponsored ways of operating within a commission. In a return to the introspective reflection on the work, in the mode of the work during the development of the 2018 NGV Architecture Commission, PRS5 was something of a correction, and it was important in sorting out the role of opposition and enemy, or the idea of the enemy, in the conception of the work, which became chapter 3. Finally, this sort of development of a new type of drawing, or a 2.5-dimensional version of an ideogram of the process of designing the bollard/seat in the square downstairs, mapped the role of all these ideas along with an expanded description of mischief in the work. Mischief was something that Leon van Schaik said in my first PRS1. He sort of thought that the title of the PhD should be called Making Mischief, and at the time that was a sort of profoundly, I thought I'd done something terribly wrong. I was too proud to hear that sort of properly until 6 years later, but he was right. So it's clear now that the things that drove the shift in my understanding of what I was doing were, in fact, my failures. Dead ends that were a result of wish thinking, superimposition, or projecting ideas on projects that the projects rejected, forced me to work less, but look harder at the behaviours in and at the time of making the work. During that careful looking, I made a series of companion artefacts that weren't the project itself, but that explained and captured my behaviour during the design of each of these projects. A key reflection became an understanding that these companions exerted their influence in providing ways to work beyond or outside the brief given to me by a commercial client in practice. The other driver of those shifts are things that happen in the margins of the PRS. It feels, at the time, at least, it felt at the time that the PhD or an active PhD is an enormous sponge through which everything that happens to you, everything in the world is filtered. And sometimes that might be a letter of resignation or a text message from Peter Brew or a drunken talk about interloping weed species. And each of those things can provide a turn of phrase or a new frame around which the whole thing swings. And it's important to sort of iterate that these often didn't happen within the panel reviews themselves, but in the margins of the event, in corridors and in bars. So in the end, the research wasn't about public good at all. It was about my good, or at least the things that I needed to introduce the officer's design project, to introduce into the officer's design process to create our own leverage. In the end, the contribution was about design practice, provided through the demonstration of an expanded definition of professional practice, one which provides practitioners their own agency over a client's brief and the ability to challenge the tropes of their discipline's engagement with site. There was a contribution to design process provided through a demonstration of how the designer's own meta brief was deployed alongside the client's official brief, giving the designer new self-sponsored ways of operating with a commission and within a site. And a contribution to design tools provided through a demonstration of model making as an urban tool that sponsors new ways for designers to work with territorial ambiguity by providing a speed and scale of making that suspends the certainties of the boundary and the introspective thinking that accompanies it. And then finally, an idea of community of practice was described where agents outside the discipline are co-opted into the field and into a design process in order to move the work beyond the default or typical response that might be expected within the world of commercial landscape practice and towards something else. They're agents of irritation, encouraging me to expand the language of a commission into one that contains more than the commission often asks for. And that more is something that I suppose is something to still reflect on. That more is an attempt to supplement the default language of my discipline with a richer vocabulary that speaks more directly to my own visual language, I suppose, and to the multivalent language of lived experience in the city. So the agency that the PhD has given the office, its leverage, is real and enduring, I think. This is not a PhD that sort of went on the shelf. It's actually catalysed the practice by giving it permission to exist in some ways on its own terms. The PhD doesn't need to be applied to the work that we do because it already is the work that we do. And the practice and its various slipstream activities were already the topic of the research. The research simply gives us permission and a language to operate between the client's brief that we're given and our own meta brief, between a space of agency and a space of speculation, so that we can leverage our own ambitions for the city that we make. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. That's the perfect tag team. This is great. So there's no presenter notes up here, so you're getting a very informal discussion, introduction from me. So my PhD was titled Mixed Reality Fabrication. It emerged after kind of going into hibernation from the PhD for a couple of years and I guess developing a practice, which was then reflected on at the end. The practice is a partnership with Cam Newnham and Nick Vandenberg. A lot of this work is done as a collaboration. It's not entirely my own. I have severe imposter syndrome, and so when John asked me to kind of reveal just how much of an imposter I am in front of everybody, it's kind of nerve-wracking. But I'm going to show some of the failures of the PhD and I guess a lot of the the hopes and dreams early on in the PhD that seemed kind of naive and then somehow found their way into being applicable through some sort of miracle. But I think I can untangle that miracle a little bit, and that's what I'll try to do today, with no notes. So I guess early on in the PhD, I was kind of interested in, or in my practice, I guess, in forms and processes that derived from like looking at natural ways, natural processes of formation. And the interest in that was partly just kind of aesthetic, but also partly based on this concern that I had that the way that we needed to operate on our natural environment or our built environment as architects was not through kind of rapid prototyping or fast, efficient construction. It was instead through processes of design that could occur over very long timescales and maybe happen very slowly in ways that could sort of gradually redirect the materials that we had at our disposal. These were very speculative projects. Like, this was a project for the outskirts of Perth, which is rapidly becoming effectively a large salt lake. It's a process which is, for the most part, irreversible, and it's something which nobody who lives there is doing anything about. And we were thinking, well, how can you work with this process of solidification to turn it into something which is beneficial and exciting rather than a negative consequence? So these are the sorts of things I was interested in as a designer. And they're all kind of blue sky fictional projects, very difficult to materialise, a project which takes place over 100 years, or to evidence that it could be materialised. And so we were also doing smaller works. This is a proposal for a meeting pod in this building, which we didn't win because it was critiqued as being unbuildable, which is fair enough. It was supposed to be built from inflated recycled plastic bubbles. So I was interested in the aesthetics of blown glass, but not in the cost of blown glass. So we lost the competition, but we were awarded a small SRC grant, almost like a consolation prize, and told, well, okay, Gwyll, if you reckon it's buildable, you go develop the computer vision and the robotics and the material systems and the tools and the actuators and all the rest of it, and you show us how buildable it is. So with Cam and with Roland, we started working on the robotics, so teaching robots to see the materials that they're working with. Then we started building our own tools, first with students, the plastic extruder and colorer on the right, and then with research assistants with James Pazzi. And I love this tool on the right. It was incredibly dangerous. I can't believe anybody let us ever build it, but what it does is it extrudes plastic with a pneumatic pressure regulator. So you can drag a slider in your design software and change how much air is being blown into this tube as you're extruding it. So this is me dragging a slider and making one of these plastic bubbles. So this was incredibly exciting because instead of exploring these kinds of material effects which emerge through digital simulations, which are kind of metaphors for material behaviours, we could explore material effects through automated control over that material using robotics. And we're interested in robots being almost analogous to craftspeople, so they can see and react to material and work with tools in a way that then goes and produces kind of qualities and effects which may be a little bit like craft. So that was at the end of 2016. PRS 4 or so, 5, 4, 3, I don't know, somewhere in the middle, I don't have my notes. And it was also when the school got their hands on some mixed reality headsets, and we realised that rather than teaching robots to work with materials in the manner of a craftsperson, we could instead give ourselves a better understanding of the kinds of digital forms that we wanted to produce, and then make them in the manner of, make ourselves more effective craftspeople. So this is a real, this is the first thing we ever did with a mixed reality headset. It's a video shot through the headset. We're trying to assemble a small table using river stones, almost like turning ourselves into 3D printers. So the contribution of the PhD kind of became about this process of using mixed reality for craft. But what I found fascinating at the time is we were playing around with the headset, and I kept asking myself, why isn't anybody else doing this? This seems so painfully obvious. You can see the thing that you're about to build in 3D. It's so much easier to build it now. My students are all going out there and making these beautiful sculptures. Before they could barely make things that look like a potato with the robot. Yeah, why isn't anyone doing this? And it turned out that I think that within engineering disciplines, there's a lot of work being done with mixed reality where people are trying to figure out whether these technologies could make existing construction processes faster, more efficient. So there's a lot of interest in solving existing known problems with AR, but there was no research done whatsoever in terms of how you might be able to design differently for the new capabilities of mixed reality and augmented reality. So design was treated as a control in a lot of this work. You'd have things which look like a space frame, which is already quite efficient to build anyway. Parts fit together in one way. And then you use augmented reality to do that and don't get very excited by it taking the same amount of time. But if you try to make things which look like this, it's very, very difficult to do in any other way. And so I was fortunate enough, I guess, to be in a position where I had a design sensibility and an interest in processes that just capitalized on this new affordance of the technology. And my job was to try, I think as part of the PhD, to reflect and map out what the implications of this technology were for designers. So what are the new opportunities and what are the constraints? Somebody's going to have to tell me when I'm running out of time. I might skip a few. Oh, okay. So in terms of the opportunities, just because we're designers here, I think one of the exciting things that emerged from the PhD is this understanding that making in mixed reality, as opposed to using machines or drawings, it allows you to exchange exactness and repeatability for speed and adaptability, like improvisation. So this is an example of what that means for design. This is a sketch for a chair. It contains no two-dimensional parts, intersecting geometry. It couldn't even physically be built. It's just a three-dimensional sketch. It takes 20 minutes, but it conveys some sort of design ideas. And then you can go and materialize that chair approximately in under a day from welded steel, which is heated and bent using an oxytorch like this while you're wearing a headset and seeing exactly what the geometry of the design should be. So it's not actually perfect. If you look at these two images, I'm not trying to fake or lie about the precision of this process. That's not actually the point. If you wanted to do it exactly, you would either rationalize the design or do it robotically, but that comes at really high cost. So I think this is kind of, this idea of giving over some design agency to the person who's making a building is also something which terrifies a lot of people, architects especially, since sort of the Renaissance, because architects tend to explicitly draw everything that will be built. You don't want a craftsperson making up details on site most of the time. But we're definitely very interested in, let's say, a different relationship between design and fabrication technology. So instead of trying to automate labour out of construction processes and replace it with the efficiency of machines, can we instead extend the capacity of skilled labour to produce more complex, more beautiful architectural designs and be able to trust those craftspeople because you're working from the certainty of a mixed reality model. So it's a bit more like the Gothic, let's say. This work originated with some experiments here with students. So we started doing things with pebbles, but very quickly wanted to scale this up. Started working with bricks. I will skip this project because I don't think we've got much time to talk about it. But I only want to mention here that there's this rapid translation to application. So even though I was interested in making forms which looked like enormous eroded salt landscapes, you could use the same principles of illustrating exactly the geometry of a design in mixed reality and context at scale to guide somebody doing conventional bricklaying. So it's able to upskill existing skilled trades and fabricators just as much as it upskills someone like me to fabricate those designs. The brick walls weren't really new geometry. They were being done by like a decade earlier by people interested in doing robotic bricklaying. And so we weren't winning over many hearts and minds with those sorts of proposals in terms of arguing about this being this revolutionary new technology for design that's going to enable some new sort of form. And we thought that better designers than I use as a royal we. I thought better designers than myself would take this technology and go and demonstrate what was possible with it, but that just didn't happen. So something that we had to do was sort of prove out the capacity of mixed reality to unlock something more than pure digital fabrication and more than pure traditional craft. And we had to demonstrate that ourselves. And so this was a pavilion that was done in Estonia in collaboration with some Simin Harm and Igor Pančić from the Bartlett and Format Engineers. And the entire pavilion is made from steam bent timber, which is assembled by hand using nothing but the geometry of the parts as guides. So there's no documentation as you would traditionally understand it. You're not documenting like formwork or making molds or doing shop drawings or any of that. It's going directly from the digital model to something that you see in mixed reality, and then you improvise how to make it from available materials. This allows us to produce an architecture which I think would normally be entirely rationalized away because it would be far too complex to make by any other means. And I like to say that it has this kind of a character which is somewhere in between the blobbiness of the digital and the sort of the roughness of rapid handcraft, not highly skilled handcraft, because the people who were building this weren't highly skilled. It's about making something quickly but efficiently, like the chair before, which I think just comes back to my sensibility as well. I like cutting corners. This is now being used by, in terms of impact, now moving to beyond the PhD. It is being used by skilled craftspeople, much more skilled than myself. It's people it's sort of doing things like doing Catalan vaulting, or this is a large whale shark in Qatar for the World Cup. Like, it's the largest thing that's been built by hand in mixed reality. The bricklaying is continuing. This was last week at, I can't remember what it's called, the Masons Institute or something in Minnesota. So they're trying to get people excited about bricklaying. These are the steel workers that do a lot of Gary's buildings. It's a fairly obvious use case, but if you're assembling double curved steel panels, it makes sense to do that from a mixed reality guide rather than from drawings. And the last thing that I'll show, again, I'm so sorry if I'm over time, been trying to go really quickly, is to try to come full circle back to the sort of early, I wouldn't call them failures, but the exuberances of the start of the PhD where I was interested in real-time robotics, because at the same time, we were trying to pip Mark for the NGV competition, and I think you might have won this one. This was 2017 when we entered, so. Okay. So I guess back in 2017, we were interested in, now it's ubiquitous, but generative AI and specifically the impact that this would have on creativity and authorship. So how, if everybody has access to design tools, will everybody become a designer, or will nobody become a designer? And we were doing proposals for the NGV which were, about the rapidness with which you could design if you have fully automated design tools. So everything was inflated bubbles that would be reproduced every week, and these sorts of crazy ideas. And this all got thrown out because we started working with mixed reality, but I've kind of returned to it now. I feel like I'm in my sort of late stage and have the luxury of going back to ideas that fascinate me. This was some work from a summer studio about a year ago where we were getting students to make 3D canvases using heat shrunk tensile membranes in mixed reality, and then applying decorations to those 3D canvases, which are designed by AI but applied by hand. So again, trying to find this between something purely digital and something that's purely craft. And so I was quite happy with this kind of outcome, this project. And the last thing I'll show, which is a bit of a joke, just to lighten the story. This is from the current design studio that I'm teaching, where I'm just trying to automate everything that the students normally do. So automate the research process, automate the design process, automate the presentation process, automate the design iteration. Because I feel like these sorts of projects should be rhetorical. They should be trying to argue for what's next. And you'll get a little little preview of what this is like if we've got
Welcome to the world of offshore salmon farming, welcome to the Salmon's Odyssey, a journey into the heart of a new frontier in aquaculture. We're at the forefront of sustainable food production, where innovation and the delicate balance of nature meet. Our story begins in the rugged waters off the coast of Scotland, where a revolutionary salmon farm stands as a testament to human ingenuity. But this isn't just about farming fish, it's about building a future where we can feed the world without harming the environment.
So all of that's generated on the fly,
challenges
that's
were
real time.
immense. We had to design a farm that could withstand the harsh marine conditions while also minimising its impact on.
And here's another example of that. This is Harlan and Eliza's project. A game where you have to get out of work.
Compost toothbrush or not, we've still got deadlines. Don't make a habit of this or you'll be starring in your own compost drama, the unemployment kind.
Sandown might have a bit of a tummy bug.
You've got to be kidding me. A compost toothbrush can't halt production. Get creative with your excuses next time, but sarcastically.
Anyway, you just have to get out of work. But again, all of that is trying to hint at what's coming next. I think that pretty soon we will be arguing with an AI about, justifying why we shouldn't come in for work that day. So it's nice that students are able to engage with that before it actually happens. Sorry if I went over time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Will, and perfect timing. I think what we'll do is have a little bit of time for questions. Would you like? You can either sit or you can stand. It's completely up to you. I'll try and sit. Yep. Let me just. Excellent. Why don't we start with the audience? Does anyone have any pressing questions for two very, very different presentations, I think, that speak to the diversity of what happens in the PhD? Paul Morgan. Oh, thank you. We've got an audience mic too.
Mark, say if I asked you to compare running a design workshop in your practice for a brief, with your team now or post-PhD compared to beforehand, how does it differ? Is it sharper, more refined?
That's an excellent question, Paul. Thank you. I think, in a sense, if we imagine running a workshop, I'll answer it absolutely literally. When I started the PhD, I worked at someone else's office. It was an office that I had, but I established, but I didn't own. So I always had this sense that I was talking for them or through them, or they were on my shoulder. And I think part of the idea about, or one of the consequences of the PhD was deciding to chuck that job in and start a new practice. Since that, and then since a lot of the tacit knowledge of the way that we work has become formalised and describable through the PhD, it's been a lot easier to talk. I often get surprised, even now, just about how direct you can be in direction about saying, you know what, I think we should do it this way because of this, this, and this. There's a sense of, I don't know, just a slightly more self-assurance or self-confidence because I actually understand it's not that tacit knowledge that's sort of invisible and somewhere else. And like Will, there's that sense of there's always that sense of being an imposter in these things, and I think being actually able to understand the habits of the work distinct from my personal habits means that it's just a lot easier to be able to talk through those ideas. So I think that's a way of saying that any sort of idea of ego or me talking as me disappears, or has disappeared recently since PhD has been completed, because I actually understand that I'm talking through the work using the language that we sort of developed through the dissertation, the ways of describing the work. So it's sort of vastly different. Answer your question.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions? How about while you think of questions, I can ask you a question. Maybe I'll ask you, Gwyl. You started your PhD in a completely different direction, I think. And it's interesting because I've had a few conversations with some candidates recently about to what extent you ignore the foundational material that starts, or where you start in the PhD. So you started with quite a lot of generative, computational experimentation, which is, I would argue, helps shape a sensibility and a design approach that then leads to particular things. You don't just leap to, the interests you had in the later half of the PhD. So how did you reconcile, other than my memory is you were desperate to finish at some particular point, how do you reconcile having to shift direction midway through?
I think this early on, most of the projects were sort of in tool development, I think. So whether that was digital tools or tools to go on the end of robots, and there's a struggle to reconcile the technical development of a tool and what that tool had to do just to work, and how that tool might be a design project in its own right. I think what ended up happening is that the tools just became so simple with augmented reality. They dissolved and disappeared, and that allowed me to focus much more on what you could then do with the tool, which was so liberating. I think without that, I just would have kept building tools the whole time.
But for people who don't, I'm conscious that some people might not actually know what phonogram is. Do you want to describe what
There's a 20-minute presentation on what phonogram is. The phonogram is a tool for fabricating with augmented reality models. So you view your design model in AR and you use that almost like a 3D template to build from, rather than using two-dimensional drawings.
that you can change in real time?
Yeah, that you can change in real time, and that interacts with a whole lot of other design software, and that's collaborative and it's highly precise. And I was trying not to do too much of a pitch. We talked about pitches before with Paul. I didn't want to pitch phonogram too hard, but maybe I didn't tell anyone what phonogram even was.
In the back.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks for your presentations. Very interesting. I'm a fine art PhD student who's very interested in lots of different things. But Mark, I was interested in your talk about or suggestion that you need to bring in more lived experience. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, and whose lived experience, how do you get the lived experience, et cetera, et cetera. My PhD is about my journey through mental health and how my mental health has impacted my artworks, and the framing is my lived experience. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your question. Look, I think my use of lived experience, talking about the experience of the city, might be misconstrued or maybe sort of open to interpretation. I'll talk specifically what I mean by that. I think that in a real sense, my PhD was focused very much within a disciplinary framework. I know there's a lot of ambition in many of the PRS, in many works done by PRS candidates, and arguably the program itself, to sort of see cross-disciplinarity as something that's important. I had to focus very specifically on landscape architecture as a discipline, and there's all sorts of complicated reasons for that, principally because I was never trained as a landscape architect, but I sort of get paid as one, so there was a kind of strange contradiction there. And I think that one of the criticisms that I had with looking at sort of orthodox responses, landscape architectural responses to the work that I was doing in a commercial context, was that they were essentially self-referential. You know, there was a kind of a mode of geometry and materials and the way things were put together and the way they were described, which, because I was never trained in that way of thinking, I always found pretty vapid. So a lot of what I understood, now understand our working process to be through doing the PhD, was that often the first thing I would do is reach for things that took me out of that framework. So things that were over and above or extracurricular to landscape architecture, and I leaned in reasonably heavily on a lot of fine art influences because I went to art school instead of going to landscape architecture school. So it was really, when I talk about lived experience, it's not with a capital L and a capital E, and I'm conscious of that term, particularly after doing the work with Amy around family violence memorial and those sorts of things. I'm not talking about it in that specific term. I'm talking about what I see as the multivalence or the sort of hyper-diversity of cities, that they aren't just one thing. They're not a pure discipline. They're not a kind of a neat box that can't be breached. You need, in the process, to sort of be porous and bring other things in.
Thank you. Everyone's too shy. Maybe just give the microphone to someone. No. I'm joking. Look, one observation, Mark, you had a pretty, there was a fantastic line you had at the end, and this comes from some recent, frequent discussions around, I think one of the things I say particularly to our staff is you don't need to complete the PhD before enrolling in the PhD. So I think there is a tendency to try and get your head around what you're doing before you actually start to do it. But the line was, does not need to be applied to the work that we do, it is the work that we do. So I suppose, and I had another conversation with someone the other day who said, I don't have time to do the PhD, I'm doing my work, etc., etc. And again, not trying to sell the PhD, we've got like 120 candidates in the school. But yeah, do you want to talk a bit about being in practice, and you as well, Gwyllim, after being in practice, and then how you actually, like what the PhD is when you, compared to the job at hand? It's a very dumb question. You're trying to see too much into it. So it's you mentioned it a little bit in doing the project and then having a notebook beside the project where you kind of try and reflect while you're doing it rather than after the fact.
Yeah, I think that maybe that idea that the PhD isn't separate to the work. It is the work. It might be the ultimate sort of penny drop moment when you finish the thing. I don't know, it'd be interesting to kind of compare other experiences, and I'm all for the idea of the keynote being about a reflection on recent completions, because I think it'd be, you know, it's kind of like, there is a sense that you sort of need a support network or a reflection on the reflection. That was, you know, that's not how it started when I started this thing. The way that we spoke about the work was almost totally irrelevant. It was totally sort of procedural. We did this, we did this, we did this, we did this. The nature of the work and why it was happening and what it might have been against or what it might have been for was all hidden, all sort of sat and exist under the surface. And I think that's, well, clearly in my context, that's about a habit of explaining your work and explaining its value to the people who are commissioning it. So in a commercial context, you sort of, you know, you big it up and say, here's this great work that I've done for you. It's, you know, going to make your world a lot better. That actually has nothing to do with the generation of the work. It's all something else. And it's amazing the capacity or the extent to which that isn't talked about in practice. It sort of takes this kind of process to draw it out.
Yeah, I can only speak to this briefly, I think. I think in my case, the design projects we were doing at Fologram were all about just eating our own dog food and using our own tools to show what was possible because we were frustrated that no other designers were doing it. And so those projects are really, they have to speak for themselves. They have to be something which looks like something that somebody else wants to imitate. That was the design brief we set for ourselves. So that's radically different to what was, I guess, written about in the PhD, where you have to, or I had to unpack, I think, a whole lot of unsaid design thinking that went into those projects and how you create something which is different in some way to the processes through which buildings are currently made. Yeah, I think that's all that I'd say to that.
Excellent. There's a question there. But while we get the mic, Gwyl, can I ask you, you took some time off RMIT and then in your spare time did a lot of what might be termed internationally as scientific papers around the work. Do you want to explain yourself?
Yeah, they were also marketing. Well, I mean, actually, I think I wrote about this in the PhD a little bit. The utility of a sort of a conference workshop as a way of doing marketing, but also proving out an idea really, really quickly with a bunch of other people in a community. It is actually incredibly, you know, as a design accelerant, I think. The papers they're so formulaic, the academic conference papers. You can write them in a day or two max. If you spend more, someone told me once if you spend more than a day on a paper, it's too long, and I agree. And so they were there just to get us an audience like this. I don't think anyone reads conference papers. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's funny, but it's also an interesting question in terms of impact. And I think for the academics in the room, you know, what's valued in academic context, which is how I started the discussion. What we know as designers is valuable, and it might be a room where there's 5 people doing something interesting that no one knows about, or some interesting technique. You do it because it needs to be done, and then this other context that is the scientific method or social science methods superimposed on what designers do. And I suppose having travelled a lot and been to a lot of architecture schools, it is incredibly privileged environment. I feel incredibly privileged here to be able to not have to spend a lot of my time doing things that I find completely irrelevant as a designer.
Maybe just quickly, the conference papers, I mean, I think what we were doing was new research in a very classical sense of, you know, a scientific contribution, but I don't think that it has anywhere near as much value as the reflection that went into the PhD book, because the conference paper just isn't the right format for that kind of reflection as a whole. So I sort of just feel like, relatively speaking, the conference papers are maybe a bit, yeah, thin.
Much more polite than me. Thank you. I think we'll take one last question. Yes.
I'm just asking this on behalf of PhD students. I finished mine, so I would have liked to hear as a PhD student. I think if you're a perfectionist, and a lot of PhD students are, I know both of you went off track from your original plan. And taking into account imposter syndrome, what are things or advice that you would give to PhD students, because I'm sure there are a lot here, who have one of the two problems or both the problems? If you have imposter syndrome and or things have not gone to plan, I think they would appreciate. So that's my question. Yeah.
Well, I think the only answer, I think the right answer is that this process that's been going on for 32 years actually is an incredibly intelligent one. It's almost got it sort of, it's not that it's bulletproof, but I think the first thing to acknowledge is that if you are a perfectionist or if you have imposter syndrome, you kind of need to lean into it. That's as much of a revelation in your practice and what informs the practice as you know, anything that you might draw or colours that you might use or things that you might build. I think, you know, from my point of view, my sort of disciplinary statelessness was an underlying anxiety that informed everything that I did, and therefore had to be the subject of the PhD, or at least part of the subject of the PhD. I know, you know, if you were a perfectionist, I think that would be a fantastic PhD, because you could lean into and try and understand where notions of control and white knuckle grip on your process comes from. But I think
You're saying research in the medium of your process.
I mean, you have to, don't you, in a way? But I think the process is excellent at teasing those things out. So I think, yeah, so lean into whatever particular conundrum or perceived problem you might have. And then the other thing is just to be absolutely open to this process. I think it's a universal thing, at least in the PhDs that seem to have had some traction and had some impact in the individuals that have undertaken them, that there is a change, a sort of massive change that happens somewhere along this course, or it's continuous change. And that change happens through being open and reflecting seriously on the things that are said in the panel discussions. Like, you know, there were things that were said in very nice ways in my early panel discussions that were sort of incredibly unsettling and made me, you know, lose any sense of self in a good way. Oh no, you know that sort of second PRS where I kept putting up that bloody picture of Robin Hood. Someone said, I'm not sure that you're Robin Hood. And it was like a sort of gut, like a knife to the gut. But I thought a lot about that for about 6 months and going, you're absolutely right. So it's about sort of, I'm not going to put in some sort of report or anything. It was a fantastic thing. But yeah, I think an openness to the process and acknowledging that you may not, your initial framing of what you think you're about is highly unlikely to be the fact of what you're about is pretty essential.
I'll try and be quick again. I think if you're stuck, you probably are stuck. That'd be my advice. Like, yep, if you think it's going badly, it's probably going badly. It's terrible. And you just have to work through it. I just don't think that doing the PhD is that different to any other design process. Design is this kind of iterative process of failure after failure after failure. I think I was really lucky I just never got stuck. I felt like I always had something I had to be doing, which maybe comes down to having a kind of an agenda prior to going into the process. So there was always something that I wanted to use the PhD to explore. And so even when the projects weren't very good, or I was being told that this was not how I should be operating, it didn't feel like there was a dead end, let's say. So.
All right, I think drinks are calling us, Andrea, so I think we'll leave it there, but thank you, audience, and thank you, Mark and Gwyl.
And thanks to you, Vivian, as well, for introducing, moderating the conversation, also to John Doyle for his inspired choice for these incredible speakers tonight. And I think in the context of thinking about regenerative futures and the creative and different types of thinking that's needed going forward, it was really fantastic to hear both of you speak through your practices and also the value of what research and the PhD can do for developing a particular way of working. So I'm really, thank you both so much for that. And I look forward to seeing you all downstairs for another drink. And maybe if you were too shy to ask questions, I'm sure that Mark and Gwyll will be happy to entertain any other thoughts you might have. Thank you both. And Vivian.